panelists. Professor Yuto Kitamura, Associate Professor at the University of Tokyo. Mr. Shunsuke Yanagi, Professor at Kyushu University. Mr. Hideyuki Mori, President, Institute for Global Environment Strategies, or IGES. Ms. Kaori, Kuroda, Executive Director, CSO Network Japan. Mr. Shuzo Nishioka, Senior Research Advisor, IGES, Secretary General, LCS-RNet, LoCARNet. Ms. Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, Professor, the New School. The panel will be chaired by Professor Norichika Kanie. Thank you. This is panel discussion 1. We have 2 panels today, but in this first panel, we would like to focus on the results of our research project, what we need to do and what we have to change. And this year will be the first year for implementing SDGs, and what are the challenges in implementing SDGs? Some of the topics that we would like to cover in this panel. So first of all, let me invite each of our panelists to spend 5 to 7 minutes for their first round comments. Which will be followed by interactive exchange of views with all the participants. Today, 3 speakers on my side have been members of our project, so they are the colleagues of mine. So first, I would like to invite those 3 members of the project to start off. Mr. Kitamura, please take the floor.
Hello. My name is Kitamura from the University of Tokyo. Our team and Professor Kanie talked about the discussion changing from MDGs to SDGs, and the development issues and environmental issues no longer were considered separately, and it became necessary to consider both at the same time. So from that kind of perspective, based on the development discussion thus far, what would become necessary in the future, and that became the theme of our research. And on the left, it's somewhat difficult to see, but what was discussed as part of the MDGs and what linked to SDGs. If we try to reorganize that, and it can be divided into 4 areas. The areas associated with people on the top, and the areas that related to society on the right, something that is related to the growth, and on the right is something to do with existence. So the related to human, the growth, that's education, and something related to the existence of human being, that's a health and hygiene and so forth, and economic development with regards to the growth of society, and the area related to existence of society, that's environment and resources. And we thought that it's important to, in fact, notice these aspects. And let me talk about a few keywords to begin with. The biggest the keyword is literacies. So we are using the plural form of the literacy, saying literacies. And when you say the literacy, you often talk about ability to write or calculate, but issues related to the earth, related to IT, the human rights, and then the health. So we need to improve literacy related to all these areas, and that is quite important as we work on SDGs going forward. So in order for us to improve literacies, education becomes very important. And the goal 4 is education. So it's not just emphasizing goal 4, but when we try to realize all of the goals of SDGs, education have important roles to play. And it is important in a sense that it leads to improvement of the literacies. And Professor Kanie talked about this, but the one keyword that we want to emphasize is the literacies. The second keyword is the equitable distribution. So the equitable and distribution put together. So how can we distribute resources in a right manner? To think about this is the second keyword. And the third is from local to global, or local and global dialogue. So the dialogue between a local and the global, that's the third. So I only have a limited time, but I would like to mention a few things with these three the keywords in mind. Now, talked about literacies. Now, what are the literacies involved? And what is particularly important for SDGs is the cross the discipline or cross area, and we call this nexus here. So we're not just talking about one area, but we need to think about areas in a linked manner. And one example, the water issues is going to be important in SDGs. So linking the water issue and education. So a water and education nexus. So improving literacies related to water is important in respect to education, but it is also important from the perspective of health, so drinking clean water. And there are a lot of the conflict around the world around water. So inclusive of the political aspect, we need to improve literacies related to water in many aspects. So that means that there is an importance in education. So we can describe this as water literacies. And the people of the working group that was talked about before, and we have been making proposal that this is one way to address the different areas. So education for improving literacies is the education called ESD. In 2004, when we had the meeting in Johannesburg, and it was proposed by Prime Minister Koizumi at this point in time, UNESCO took the lead, and for the 10 years until last year, ESC was promoted around the world. But there was one major issue, which was that how can the progress be monitored and evaluated? That was not made clear. So our team wanted to combine various evaluation method, and like the radar chart you can see here, we've indicated that we can actually do the monitoring in this May. So we've had discussion with the Ministry of Education, and we have decided to propose this to UNESCO going forward. Also, if we take the perspective of health, and I talked about the equitable distribution before, and Professor Kanie in his presentation said that in the world today, when we looked at poverty, there is two issues occurring at the same time, which we refer to as double burden, the problem of starvation and the problem of obesity. But the problem of obesity in the developing nation may not ring a bell to you, but we are starting to see an increase in the population of obese children in the developing nations as well. But at the same time, we have this issue of hunger, where there isn't enough food, but at the same time, there is an issue of obesity. So we need to address these issues at the same time. And like Professor Kanie said before, in terms of calorie, there is still sufficient. There is already sufficient amount in the world. It is sufficient in one area, but it's not sufficient in other areas. So we need to strike the balance. And for that, we need to achieve the equitable balance or this equitable the distribution. And the economic poverty is also having an impact in the other areas like health, and this is something that became apparent as part of our research. And I talked about the dialogue between local and the global before, and previously what was discussed at the global level was reflected what is to be done at local level. But as at SDGs, it's important to also reflect something that has been built upon at a local level. In other words, linking something that is local to global is also important. And there is a governance concept that comes in. And when we think about governance, we need to be mindful of equitable distribution. And this is something that we want to continue to conduct our research upon. So the conclusion reached on this occasion, in order for us to achieve the fair and equitable distribution, and we need to improve the literacies of people. And like Professor Kanie said before, we have wisdom, and so it links to wisdom in that sense. I was very quick, but that was a description of our research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very to-the-point presentation in a short presentation. You mentioned 3 key points. One, first is literacies. It's a plural form of literacies, and about equitable distribution, and also connecting local and global. So those were the 3 keywords that he used to make the presentation. I would like to ask Professor Managi from Kyushu University to make a presentation. My name is Managi from Kyushu University. For myself, I would like to talk about the improvement of energy efficiency, eradicating waste, detailed targets against SDGs, what kind of a cost will have to be borne by each country. So we did the estimation. So what I would like to focus on is to come up with a mechanism to make a comprehensive evaluation. We came up with a mechanism to be used by each local government and by national government. And as we implement the SDGs, we need to have a quantitative target, and we need to have a mechanism in place so that we can evaluate the progress. So one of the ways to do this is we presented a report at the United Nations. First, we measured what happens if we measure the environment using economic indicators. That was done for each country. And according to the report that was submitted last year, we looked at education. We evaluated education using economic indicators. And what we're going to do this year is to look at health. We want to include health in our evaluation. So we use different perspectives to do the evaluation. If we can, what is the value of reducing poverty by 10%, or what is the impact, or what is the value of reducing environmental pollution by 10%? So the value would differ from one country to the other. So we need to adjust from one country, between countries to do the evaluation. And when we do the evaluation will be done by each country, and the report will be submitted. And then SDG, we would like to create a tool to run PDCA cycle. As we reported in a scientific journal, Science. So the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Targets, are they sustainable? And we came up with a mechanism to evaluate comprehensively the progress of SDGs. And as shown at the bottom of the slide, we have related UN institutions. We engage the directors of all these institutions in our discussions. For example, in the case of environment, on the left-hand side, we have UNEP. If it's a health issue, we have WHO. And if it's education, we have UNESCO. And we do not only look at the environmental issues, but rather we look at environment, health, and education. We try to look at different aspects at the same time to come up with comprehensive evaluation. And if we come up with something global, the indicators and the ideas will be used in reality, and for it to be made to be usable, just like GDP, we need good practices. To do that, what we are doing is we are trying to do the evaluation for each and every local government. This is an example of what we did. The horizontal axis is inclusive wealth indicator, new national wealth or inclusive wealth, shinkokufu as we call it in Japanese. So that is growth rate for IWI, and the vertical axis is the GDP for each prefecture. As shown in the table, there is a correlationship. The areas that are more affluent have more wealth, but there are variations at the same time. So if GDP, which is the total amount of consumption investment, so that cannot be that is something that cannot be explained by using GDP. So we are working together with local governments to achieve the growth. So we are working with the local governments, and people who are in charge of environment, people who are in charge of urban development, would have the same perspective to evaluate, to come up with comprehensive evaluation. If you only look at traffic, that what kind of impacts would traffic has on environment and also on society, even if there's an improvement in traffic or transportation, that may reduce the or that may compromise the health of the local community. So this is something that we would like to do. So if we focus on environment, there is an example shown here for each prefecture. In the case of environment, what is the value of nature for each prefecture? So we can do a certain kind of ranking, but how much natural value, natural capital value, is it higher than CO2 loss? And what is the trend is something that we can also look at. And this is the final slide on my presentation. These are the indicators to evaluate the prefecture or local government. And if it's a case of a corporate, when the corporates make proposals on infrastructure establishment, what kind of contribution could it make to the community? So this is a kind of indicator that could be utilized to make such proposals. So in the fields, by making improvements, each SDG level can be improved. So there is SDGs has an issue of too many indicators, very difficult to come up with comprehensive evaluation. This is something that we can improve. We have indicators that can come that with which we can have a comprehensive evaluation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. When we started this project, how to gauge or measure new values. I mean, we are in the process of transformation towards the new world, and 2015 was a major step towards transformation. If what we need is transformation, then there is a need for yardstick to measure the degree of transformation. Inclusive wealth, I believe, can serve as one of the yardsticks. What cannot be measured by GDP, the measure of happiness and otherwise, these will have to be taken into cooperation, into consideration to gauge and measure wealth. I mean, this is a new challenge. Thank you. Yet another partner of our project, I would like to call on Mr. Mori, President, IGES, Institute for Global Environmental Strategy, to take the floor. Take it away. Thank you. The theme for our team, I mean, we have a set of global goals. How to effectively implement global goals was the theme that we discussed. And from the perspective of building an effective governance, we have tried to analyze what we need to do. Before we discuss the content, allow me to say a word about the basic understanding. SDGs, not MDGs. I mean, SDG was preceded by MDGs, and we need to inherit what has been achieved by MDG to implement SDGs, education, health, poverty. The items that we find in SDGs are is an extension of those goals that used to be in MDG. So now we have SDGs, and there has been an increase in the number of goals on environmental challenges. Typically, SDG 12, Sustainable Consumption and Production, SDG 13, Climate Change, SDG 14, Ocean, and 15 is Biodiversity. So those are the SDGs related to environmental issues. In comparison to the MDGs, what makes SDGs different is that MOI, means of implementation, there are a lot of descriptions about MOI's means of implementation. So that is an improvement, I believe, over MDGs. So this presentation, I mean, we have goals for environmental issues, and we have other societal objectives, poverty, for example. What are the difference in terms of governance? What will be the drawbacks when there is insufficient implementation? In order to make initiatives more effective, what are the global background that we need to look at? Those are the things that we have looked at in conducting our project. I know that this is a very busy slide. I was asked to put together only 2 slides. That is why we have put everything in these 2 pages. Top left graph. Yeah, this is next to impossible to find what's on this graph, but this shows the number of MDGs on pace to achieve and the governance effectiveness. There is a positive correlation between the two. So the more effective the governance in the hands of a government, the more achievement in terms of MDGs these governments have been able to achieve. So this is about MDGs. So we have poverty, education, and other social health as well, social goals. So this is just about the analysis of social goals. So what about environmental goals? In the case of developing countries in Asia, we have conducted analysis into the level of achievements on environmental goals. Back in 1992, after the Rio Summit, Agenda 21 was established. And Agenda 21 has been translated into country-specific Agenda 21, and local Agenda 21 has been put together by local governments, and this is how Agenda 21 has been implemented over the years as a follow-up of Agenda 21. And we have conducted a separate analysis on the implementation of Agenda 21. And what we find is that country-level strategy formulation has been completed, but as a matter of practice, almost no country has reached the stage of implementing or reviewing their strategies. Therefore, different from the implementation of social challenges, the implementation level of implementation was much lower when it comes to environmental goals in comparison to social goals. So we now have a set of global goals. So what process do we need to implement these goals? Just to give you an example, each actor, be it a country, government, or companies, they will have to translate these goals into their own goals. Global SDGs may not apply equally to all countries. It will be different amongst developing and emerging countries. Important priorities may differ. And this diagram at the bottom left-hand side, for electricity and water access is of critical importance. This is very much a social challenge for emerging countries. They are experiencing high economic growth, therefore effective use and efficient use of resources is obviously going to be an important goal for the access and efficiency have been ensured in advanced countries. Therefore, trying to restrain the use and consumption of resources will be a key for developed countries, advanced countries. Therefore, the priority will be different for each of these countries, so that all these goals for a specific country will be of high relevance. And in translating SDGs into country-specific goals and actor-specific goals, financing technologies are obviously very critical. PDCA cycle was mentioned by Mr. Managi towards the end of his presentation, but monitoring obviously is a critical part of PDCA. And no longer we live in a world where we can expect UN to centrally implement this. We also need to utilize the funds in the hands of private sector. In the absence of that, there is a consensus these SDGs will never be achieved. A coalition of willing UNEP may not be the only one to monitor. In case of environmental challenges, all actors will have to come together to monitor. That is going to be critically important when it comes to financing. We talk about blended financing at the bottom of this. We are not just talking about public finance. We need to add private sector financing so that the volume of financing will be bigger by combining public and private financing to address the growing needs, financing needs. And this is one of the critical approaches that we need. Moving on to the second slide. For financing mechanism, we have focused much on analyzing financing mechanism. We divide it into environment and non-environmental. For financing of environmental projects, in comparison to non-environmental challenges, the risk could be higher when it comes to environmental investments, and the payback period could be longer. Therefore, opportunity cost could be greater, and this is not suitable for short-termism in trying to generate a profit. And in comparison to non-environmental challenges, environmental challenges in terms of financing could be more challenging. Therefore, financing mechanism to hedge all these risks will be essential. And blended finance is key. There could be different ways, and all these different ways will have to be mobilized so that these risks associated with environmental challenges can be overcome. And when it comes to recipient of financing, the multilateral organization institutions would have allocated fund to countries in needs, but direct financing from a financial provider. We need to build direct access modality and enhance the effectiveness of direct access modality, and that was another thing that we have analyzed. For example, climate change adaptation fund is a good example in trying to provide direct access to financing. And this will result in enhanced ownership of those receiving these funds, and combined with experts on the ground, knowledge and experience could be widely shared. So this is one of the positives of ensuring direct access to financing. This is something that we have observed. So a direct access modality is something that we need to further utilize. This concludes my comments on the result of our research. Thank you.
Thank you. So when we go to implementation, something that is very important, could be most important, I think, which is governance. And Mori-san's group out there considered this aspect effective governance. And the issues associated with funding, inclusive of the private sector funding. So these were taken into consideration, and the outcome were shared with us. So from here on, we will hear from 3 people. The 3 people so far were the members of our project, but the next 3 people have been looking at this project from the outside. So outcome of the project or the result, and how that led to SDGs, and how the research has progressed. And I would like to receive comments in that perspective. And the evaluation of SDGs themselves, whether they were good or not, and how could it be made better, and what direction could we head towards in the future to make it better. That could be your comment, or it could be a question towards the research team as well. So maybe if you could comment from those perspectives. So to begin with, I would like to ask the executive director of the CSO Network Japan, Ms. Kaori Kuroda. CSO stands for Civil Society Organization. So from the perspective of civil society, we researchers tend to look at things from objective perspective, but something that was decided at the global level. How is this evaluated from more the local level, like a civil society level? We have received comments previously from that perspective, but it may be if I could first ask Ms. Kuroda to comment. Hello, everyone. My name is Kuroda from CSO Network. From just after lunch, we had the remarks, a report, and keynote speech, and I think they have all covered the keywords and so forth. But what I think is very important is linkages now towards implementation of the SDGs. Say, for example, between local and global, or the developed nations and developing nations. Something that may be difficult is the linkages between different departments and agencies, and across some sector linkage. There could be linkages between different the issues, but linkages beyond sectors. So multi-stakeholder linkage. And that's a perspective from which I would like to comment. And the Professor Kanie made a report before and talked about that in order for the SDGs to be implemented, there is a need to reflect the targets in accordance with the local situation. And for Japan, we'll be putting that together and making report going forward. But what will be the indicators? What are we going to be measuring? And we tend to be putting together data from that kind of process. But that process itself, I think, is very important. So getting the involvement of the relevant stakeholders. So when we adopt this type of process, I think there is a significant role for the civil societies as well. And the United Nations and international organizations also have great expectations on the civil societies as well in that sense. Now, the S11 group has come up with kind of the prescription, and based on the existing laws and the system, I think they are insufficient to achieve the SDGs. So the perspective of human rights and the disparities, the poverty, there are a lot of difficult issues, or those issues that can not be resolved immediately. And as a consequence, that will lead to gaps. And in order for us to fill the gaps, it's important for people from various perspectives to participate. And as part of the prescription, and Professor Kanie also talked about this, said that he wanted to make that as the starting point of discussion, as just one thought. But for Japan, when Japan starts to have greater discussions on SDGs going forward, I think that prescription will have largely a meaning. So there are a lot of indicators as shown here, and they will become the base. And hope that the discussions will be held from the multi-stakeholder perspective. Now, what I'm talking about may be difficult for you to understand, so let me talk about specific examples, so food or agriculture. And if you could open slide 6. And on 2.1, talking about the lowering the environmental load. And as part of that, and this is something promoted by Minister of the Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, and the eco-farmer accreditation. Now, eco-farmer were increasing ever, but started to decrease from one point in time. And the reason for that is, and it talks about the aging population in the farmers. But people have started to say that the income don't increase despite great effort is required. But there are other type of accreditation like IGES and so forth, which leads to a confusion at the consumption level. So the retail don't want to get involved. A friend of mine, a farmer, did not actually update the accreditation. So the indicators like this, are they appropriate or not? So whether it be the farms or the consumers who actually buy these, so it's the consumer behavior. So discussion needs to be held with the involvement of the consumer organization as well. And so one may, I think in that sense, a kind of a starting point was proposed. And I've talked about an example here, but at a global level too, immediately after the adoption of the SDGs, the Global Partnership for Sustainable the Development Data was established. So not the government taking a central role in making decisions, but the private sector businesses, the civil societies, all are participating to come up with data that will contribute towards sustainable development. And so a type of framework like this also exists. And the researchers, I think S11 have created a great outcome. But as we work on the multi-stakeholder process going forward, I think the roles of the researchers will continue to be very important. So it's not a question per se, but I would definitely like to hear about what the researchers will be doing going forward. So at the national level or the regional level, when you work on creating systems, and I said that the civil society is important, but it's important for the researchers to also participate. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So having a linkage is very important. That is something that you highlighted. And COP outcome related to climate change, it's same there. The most important message would be that the world is moving towards sustainability. So low carbon is one thing. So that direction cannot be changed, which I believe is the most important message. If that is the case, it is better to take quick actions. So those people or those organizations who have that in mind need to be connected, I believe is very important. So you talked about the prescription that we created, as Ms. Kuroda correctly mentioned, increasing the accreditation of eco-farmers. I think it is very important to have a place for discussions. And at the very end of the prescription, there is a category of governance. So we are proposing an ideal way of implementing SDGs. If you can take a look at page 45 or 46, to come up with a mechanism where we can discuss with stakeholders. If we are to come up with mechanisms, I'm sure that stakeholders differ from one target to another. So I think it's going to be difficult, but putting together the stakeholders would lead to implementation of SDGs. As for the question you have raised, I would like to answer to it later. Now I would to ask the senior research advisor of IGES, and he has other titles. I would like to ask Mr. Nishioka to give a comment, and I would also like him to give some criticisms or questions to the research team. I'm sure that many of you know about Mr. Nishioka. He has been making efforts to realize a low-carbon society, and in the past, when I took part in a TV program with Mr. Nishioka, he was called Mr. Low Carbon Society. So he has been engaged in this field for a long period of time. So I would like him to give some comments to the research team from his broad and deep experiences. Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. So already today, when we think about the global environment, we cannot continue what we have been doing so far. I think there is a need to come up with a clear vision to go forward. So I think the vision has been realized with the SDGs. I think the Japanese team has made huge contributions in coming up with the SDGs. And as Ambassador Oike mentioned earlier, last year, 2015, was a year of a major transformation. I think we need to be aware of that. But unfortunately, in Japan, we don't have that kind of awareness. So people still believe that we can continue with business as usual. For me, climate is extremely important, and I do hope that we will be reinforcing our efforts using SDGs. Well, SDGs is extremely broad, but I think we need to promote the SDGs to the general public in a joint manner. 1957, about more than 50 years ago, a famous professor said that the world is warming, there's a global warming, and that trend cannot be reversed. So at last, in Paris, it seems as though that this trend has been stopped. I think a very good outcome was generated through the discussions in Paris. MDGs and SDGs, and also when we look at the transformation, during the time of MDGs, there was no word of nature. There was only one thing related to sustainability, but with SDGs, there are many related to environment and climate change. I believe will play the leading role, and climate change, as Professor Kanie mentioned earlier. So they came up with an extreme conclusion that zero emission is the only option. After the Industrial Revolution, as we have seen in the video, we have seen increase in the CO2 emissions, and a lot of people have been doing various experiments, and the conclusion was clearly presented by organizations like ICP, that zero emission was the only option. So what I would like to ask a question is how you came up with that ratio. So putting that aside, so during the two generations, 70 years, by 2050, we need to reduce by 50%, 2 tons per person. Today, 10 tons per person. For a very short period of time, we need to change or transform the society. We need to be aware of that. And we need to raise the awareness among the public together. If we don't do that, things would not change. We have been working to realize low-carbon society for probably over a decade. And it is very difficult to change the existing structure to achieve it. And I So climate change issue has a very clear target or clear goal. So therefore, investments to be made to in terms of infrastructure and also advancement of scientific technologies. So things are actually moving to so tackle the issue of climate change. So SDGs could be incorporated. So there is a global calculator in UK, 1,200 kilocalories can be achieved with the limitation of 2 degrees. But the issue is that there is no equitable distribution, as we have been saying. That would be covered by SDGs, the world of 2 degrees and the world of SDGs. How can we put these two worlds together? I still have some more time. And we need to come up with a specific process, quantitative process. People say that Paris meeting was a successful meeting. The reason why it was successful was because there was a presentation of INDC to each country, so which led each country to start thinking about what needs to be done by each country. And so what will be, and questioned each country, what will be the responsibility borne by each country. In the past, it was the developed countries paying the money or doing the funding, which would be spent by developing countries. But if we are to implement specific progress, of course, development countries need to provide the funding, and developing countries need to take actions. So in the Paris Agreement includes all these things. So by looking into details, we were able to identify various problems, and we were able to come up with specific steps. So that is the kind of approach that needs also to be taken. And lastly, one more important thing about the Paris meeting is that the time for negotiation is over. Now is the time to start actions. So the players have changed. So the negotiation is over. So therefore, the players need to take actions. Who are the players? It's the local government, national government, it's the businesses, and also the funds who will be doing the funding. And the most important, I believe, is the researchers. I think it's very important for someone to lead the local community. The researchers do not only have to write papers. So they're saying agent of change. So that is something that should come from SDGs.
Thank you. The Paris Accord and climate change. Ambassador Oike mentioned that there are 4 critical events, and these were 2. Before being involved in SDGs, I used to be involved in climate change. So looking at SDGs from climate change perspective, SDGs translate into specific actions, and that is one of the ways to look at SDGs in that regard. Concrete actions will have to be implemented. And Professor Nishioka said before he ended, climate change asked the countries to submit concrete plans. But as I said earlier on, SDGs is quite the opposite in terms of its pattern. It was a top-down approach. There was this global decision first, which led to decisions by specific countries, each country. So to what extent are we going to oblige? To what extent are we going to provide incentives? Those can be challenging, but countries will start putting up targets and goals, country-specific goals to achieve sustainable development towards in 2030, and this remains as a challenge. Thank you, Professor Nishioka. Last but not least, we would like to call upon Professor Sakiko Fukuda-Parr at the New School. She was kind enough to travel from New York. Professor Fukuda-Parr has been leading a research project on Millennium Development Goals. She's shared with us lessons learned from MDGs and potential improvements going forward. And her papers were a starting point of our research project, and Professor Fukuda-Parr has been a confider for us. Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm Sakiko Fukuda-Parr.
To thank Professor Kanie and his colleagues for the invitation to this symposium, and also congratulate the project, which is, as we have heard, is quite clearly an extraordinarily wide scope, in-depth sort of a research action project that has not only studied various dimensions of the post-2015 agenda and the SDGs, now incorporated as the UN 2030 agenda, but also participated very actively in the extraordinary process of debates that have been going on. And since I live in New York, I have watched some parts of this extraordinarily participative process that has involved multitude of workshops and events and online debates and things of that kind. I want to say a few words that reflect on how the SDGs actually take account of the lessons learned from the MDGs. And much of my work has actually been quite critical of the SDGs. And you know, there are two kinds of views on the SDGs. You know, one that says, you know, they're worse than useless. You know, that's what the Economist said. And Bill Easterly said the SDGs should stand for senseless, dreamy, garbled. On the other hand, many of the activists who fought very hard and lobbied delegations in the process of the SDG negotiations are much more satisfied by the wide scope of the SDGs. And so, you know, one statement reflects this: we can declare partial success in every category, which is more than we might have dared hope for in 2010 under the reign of the deeply inadequate MDGs. And so the MDGs, the SDGs actually reflect a major shift from the MDGs. And we've heard some of this already in earlier statements. I'd just like to reiterate, first of all, that this is not a universal and not a north-south agenda. And I think this is important, that it's not an aid agenda, but it is a universal aspirational agenda. Secondly, it is not a sustainable it is not an agenda about poverty. It is a sustainable development agenda that incorporates environmental, social, and economic dimensions. And it is not just about removing poverty, but it is a broader developmental agenda. And thirdly, it has a different politics. Because, as we have already heard, the process was led by governments, and in contrast to the MDGs that were led by development ministers of the North. So the SDGs arose out of the Rio +20 conference, in which major emerging countries like Brazil and Colombia played a very important role, and where civil society organizations, including academic organizations and groups, played a very important role. And in fact, you know, if you actually study the process, it's quite interesting how the Secretary General's initiative to have a top-down process was kind of displaced by the political negotiations among the states. And in substance, the SDGs depart from some key shortcomings of the MDGs. And first of all, simplicity is what the MDGs are actually praised for. But in my mind, this was actually simplification. And the MDGs actually were extremely reductionist. They redefined development to a very simple concept of delivering basic needs. And it excluded what was important about the SDGs, I beg your pardon, MDGs, was not so much what was in the 8 goals, but what was not in the 8 goals. So many important things were not in the MDGs. For example, all of the issues of employment, climate change, what is exactly, in fact, the most important challenges of our times were not there. Moreover, they did not reflect any of the social and political determinants of why we have an unjust, unequal world that is reproducing poverty. And so if we want transformation, we cannot continue business as usual, going in the same direction. We have to change course. And so we have to address some of the difficult questions. And this is what the MDGs did not include. And so, you know, there were all these off-the-table issues like shifting power structures and social relations, some politically, you know, sensitive issues like sexual and reproductive rights, but also quite simple issues like literacy was not there. It was only school enrollment was there. So this is extraordinary simplification. And it was the problem of quantification because it relied so much on quantitative goals. It tended to create this very simple narrative. You know, development is all about putting every child in school, 100% enrollment rate. And, you know, it led to a kind of a mindset of finding simple silver bullets that could be delivered by technology. Second of all, the other major shortcoming of the MDGs was the neglect of national context, that because there was a single one-size-fits-all target set to be achieved not only at the global level, but in every single country, regardless of the starting point. So you had to have the rate of poverty, whether you started with 70 or 80% as in Tanzania, or whether you started with 10 to 20% in, let's say, Chile. And of course, African countries appear to be behind and off target because they started very far behind. But actually, if you calculate the rate of progress, they were making very fast progress and doing much better. So they were, in fact, not only not very sensible, but also unfair in terms of neglecting national contexts and challenges. And the third point is that this very sort of obsessive focus on outcomes also meant that the means of implementation were not there. So the SDGs are criticized by those who are seeking simplicity by saying that you should not have means of implementation confused with outcomes. But actually, the fact that the means of implementation are there means that there is a recognition of a much greater complexity. So I think that given that I have very little time left, maybe what I should focus on is on commenting some of the remarks that have been made. Now, first, equity is something that has been emphasized by several speakers this afternoon. But I think we have to remember that there is equitable distribution within countries and between countries. So there is a global dimension to equity and distribution. And the global dimensions of equity require changes in global rules. So, for example, there is Target 3B, which is about access to medicines. And it says that we must have full access to medicines and take account of the TRIPS flexibilities, that is the WTO rules about patent protection. The Secretary General has set up a high-level panel of experts on access to medicines, to which I have had the privilege of being appointed recently. And we are going to be working on the incoherence between the right to health and international trade and investment, because it is recognized that there is an incompatibility between some rules of trade, some practices of investment, and the MDG, so this is SDG goals for health. And this brings me to a second point about interlinkages. There are interlinkages, of course, but there is also the potential for inconsistency and incompatibility amongst the multitude of 17 goals and 169 targets. And I think this is something that we also need to work on. And so maybe the most important thing to remember are not so much the goals per se, but the principles. Principles such as sustainability to begin with, leaving no one behind, and themes of and transformation. Transformative agenda is the title of the 2030 agenda. Finally, just a word on the indicators. I think that one of the lessons of the indicators, now we don't have indicators for the SDGs yet, they are going to be announced in March. One of the lessons of the indicators is that they were very poorly chosen for some of the important priority issues. For example, if you have indicators that are not susceptible of disaggregation, it is very difficult to monitor the equity agenda. And finally, Mr. Kanie made a very important point earlier, saying that we have a sort of a new process, a new method of global governance by setting goals and then working out an implementation strategy afterwards. But there again, because goals and targets are sort of simplified reductionist numbers, we have to be careful not to be too literal and too, obsessed by this target achieving objective. And remember that these targets do not represent some sort of a massive global Gosplan of central planning gone mad, but they are sort of indicative framework for the way that you can monitor progress in achieving transformative sustainable development in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Fukuda-Parr. So you pointed out very important things throughout your presentation, but in particular, I realized by your presentation that, because they address equity issue, now the global, in terms of global level equity, we have to struggle with changing the rules that exist out there. And I think that's one of the implications of what I said in my presentation about starting from making the goals. Now, getting into the implementation means that we have to also deal with existing rules and transform the rules to new forms of rules that fit into the new goals and targets. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we are facing. As we agreed, it should be easier, but that's the principle, and in reality, it may be a little difficult. ありがとうございます。それでは
Thank you. We have like 20 minutes to go, so I'm wondering if you have any questions or comments from the floor. I mean, any comment or question is welcome. And I would like to bring the questions and comments to the panel. So please raise your hands if you have any questions or comments. On the front row, there is yet another expert advisor Professor Tomimoto of Yamaguchi University, who is sitting on the front row. So I would like to ask him to speak first. This is Tomimoto of Yamaguchi University. I used to be a JICA planning department officer in charge of promoting MDGs in Japan. There was almost no researcher on MDGs, so those were old days. We produced a leaflet on MDGs with Asian Institute on Asian Economy. And it gives me a great pleasure that we now have SDGs, and I was honored to serve as an advisor in this SDG process. Professor Fukuda-Parr, I was impressed by your presentation. You were a bit critical of MDGs. I'm not that negative about MDGs. I mean, there were positives. I mean, by giving focus on poverty, particularly in developing countries, MDGs has been helpful in assisting advanced developing countries to address the poverty issue and to improve their statistics. So that was one of the positives of MDGs. So I'm hesitant to look at MDGs too negatively. There has to be a balance in assessing the outcome of MDGs. And the same holds true to SDGs. I mean, there are those who are critical of SDGs, as Professor Parr mentioned. But if you want to be positive on SDGs, I mean, there is a need. SDGs will give a particular focus on Japanese agenda, and we all share the responsibility in addressing poverty and demographics or declining population in Japan. These are some of the challenges that Japan faces. And Japan should feel obliged to address these issues in achieving SDGs related to these issues. And who should report and disseminate information to the international community, MOFA, Ministry of Environment, or JICA, or government-affiliated agencies should not be the only actors. Civil society and higher education institutions such as UNU need to be a part of this process in achieving this. And there will be a need for us to generate a climate conducive for that when it comes to the question of reporting. Secondly, Professor Managi, as a report I was looking at, and it came as a surprise. IWI, page 2, Inclusive Wealth Indicator. This was a joint initiative by UN and UNU, and Yamaguchi Prefecture is at the furthest left. We enjoy quite a bit of growth rate, but this was rather shocking. To be honest with you, I also serve as an advisor for the prefecture government of Yamaguchi, and I would very much like to report this to the government of Yamaguchi Prefecture. The people in Yamaguchi Prefecture are quite satisfied. We are ranked number 16th amongst the 47 prefectures in Japan. So how to interpret IWI, and we need to identify issues, and we need to overcome these issues. And this is a challenge that I would like to share with the government of Yamaguchi Prefecture. And we've talked about the importance of combining global and local. I've teaching my students the importance of having local perspectives. Our students should travel to developing countries so that they have a global perspective, and we want to promote SMEs in Yamaguchi Prefecture to be more global, and we have been trying to support SMEs initiatives. So we are now in Aoyama, in Tokyo, at the heart of Tokyo, but not just UNU, but higher institutions of higher education locally, and prefectural governments and local businesses should try to be a part of the process of implementing SDGs, and we want to make sure that this will also be a message in the textbooks for elementary school and junior high school kids. We will be coming back to the panel later on, but I'm wondering if there's any other questions or comments from the floor. I'm wondering if we see any hands. Yes, in the middle of the fifth row. Please, if you don't mind, share with us your name and affiliation at the outset.
Institute. I'm involved in the development sociology, but how to communicate to Japanese society? One thing that is on my mind is that you're talking about the transforming the world, but I don't think this is transformation per se. So it's an agreement that we need to be prepared. So we made an agreement on what had not been achieved. That has not been communicated too well. And Kanie-san said that the current perspective is wrong. What has not been agreed to is that SDG is an economic growth strategy, and I don't agree to that. Now, Goal 8 talk about inclusive economic growth, but this is mainly something for the developing countries. But for Japan today, if we talk about growth, it's basically business as usual. But that in itself is insufficient, and the Japanese government agreed to that. That is an important point. And my question is that, and so the recognition that the economic growth is the basis, and what do you think of that? That is my question. So thank you. And the person in the center section.
Thank you very much. I was running my own business. I'm doing some volunteer activities for public safety. I wish for the peace of all the participants to start with. I am doing volunteer activities for public safety, and the keyword is no one left behind. And I am doing some studies on integrated medicine, and I believe that medicine and long-term care need to be changed to be sustainable. Integrated medicine, no one left behind. And I'm doing volunteer activities in the community, living with each other. Global safety network is a message that is being communicated. So the total participation, how can we establish the public safety is something that I find it difficult to achieve. Any comments from the panelists? Thank you very much. So it was a question related to social security. There is another hand on the left-hand side.
Before we go back to the panel, we would like to entertain this following question. I have this following question. One point I wanted to raise was that I cannot agree with you more, Professor Parr, with regards to how we should assess SDGs. The advanced countries are running out of money, and it seems as if they think PP will be the panacea. When it comes to the issue of governance, I'm most concerned about non-participation by community in implementing PPPs. Ecological, social, and economic aspects should be evaluated on a community basis. In Japan, there is no national level governance structure with the involvement of multi-stakeholders, so we should start from there in Japan. Meanwhile, when it comes to ODA and when it comes to roles that Japan should play in the world, the impact on the ground, whether the impact is positive or negative, is something that we need to assess. So both in Japan and outside Japan, the communities have to be in a position to assess, and their researchers can make a major contribution in assisting communities to make assessments and evaluations. I know that there is no specific plan at the moment, but I would like to ask you what roles that researchers can play in assisting communities to assess the achievements. I hope that there will be another round, but for the time being, we would like to go back to the panel. And let me start from here. for the questions that you want to respond, or for the questions that you can respond, please respond. Mr. Kuroda talked about future plans and next steps to be taken, and what kind of commitments researchers are to make. And Managi, Professor Managi, you also have a specific question for you, so please be succinct. Thank you. I appreciate our panelists' comment and comments from the floor. Those comments were all intriguing, informative. So I would like to link your questions to what we need to do in the future. I mean, there is a lack of understanding in Japan, so there are initiatives to be taken by the government and the researchers. There are things that researchers have to do, and what practitioners will have to do. ESD, Education for Sustainable Development. This is participation and problem-solving type of learning, and this is something that we need to implement, practice with communities. I have visited elementary schools and junior high school students, and I have walked on the streets with kids, and how to approach the issue of disaster risk reduction, and I have been engaged in safety education, ESD. The government's Central Education Council is now in the process of revising educational guideline, and ESD will be a part of the next education guideline for Japan. We, the researchers and practitioners, are to translate that into concrete initiatives on the ground in communities and at schools. This is not just to focus on particular discipline. I mean, I know that one of the negative evaluations of SDGs is that SDG is too broad, but SDGs being broad gives us a possibility that this could be approached in different ways on the ground at schools. I have visited some cities to hold workshops for high school kids, and come March in Bangkok, we will have a gathering of youth from Asian countries. Southeast Asian countries. So this is going to be a workshop for the young from Southeast Asian countries, and I will be a part of ESD. And ESD, I believe, is going to be an effective tool when it comes to the field of education. If I may add just one thing. Again, in the field of education, relative poverty amongst the young in Japan, an increase in the number of kids with foreign origins, and there are many challenges even in Japan. Transformation from MDGs to SDGs is a transformation from quantity to quality. There was this discussion about starvation and obesity. One of the reasons of obesity is that they take low-quality food to generate to obtain calorie. And health literacy, if there's a health literacy, people will have a better information to pick and choose what they take. So MDGs and SDGs will be looked at from the perspective of education, and I think that is very important.
And from my perspective, and the criticism towards SDGs and the wealth indicator that I have proposed, how that is put together and what I'm doing. Let me talk about that. First, SDGs. One of the criticism was that it's worse than not having something. There are people who make criticism in that way. And the reason for that is that when the objectives are not clear, having something like this will not lead to any incentives. And what they're saying is that what type of specific policies can be created that would change the behavior of people. Unless something like that is provided, nothing will be done. It's just a waste of budget. So using SDG as a trigger and come up with the 17 goals that no one will criticize. They're too many, but it covers everything and 169 targets. So what to prioritize it can be done at the national level or local level. I think that was done. But providing incentives to create importance So this is cost-benefit analysis in one sense. So is the project worth investment, or is it infrastructure worth investment? And that is reflected in the wealth indicator index that we created. Now, it's been almost 5 years since the Great East Japan earthquake, and if we calculated the value of economy based on the seawalls, and would they withstand earthquake? And the result of the calculation was that it was not worth building these seawalls. And if we had such a budget, then we could have used that for other purposes. So it wasn't the right the decisions. But many of the cities in the northeastern part of Japan has created these seawalls. So we should stop that, and we made a proposal that it should be used for other purposes. So whether the budget usage is appropriate or not, and the benefit for the infrastructure, and also reflecting other the items. And those in the example of Yamaguchi in terms of wealth, the size of the economy will be reflected. One may be wealthy, and one is satisfied, and something that is worth spending money on is something that would attract a good evaluation. In the case of Philippines and Manila, there are a lot of people in poverty. So sometimes the value or indicates may show a low score. But if the total volume increases next year from this year, and the year after from next year, and so growth, the meaning of the growth, inclusive growth. So comprehensive evaluation that will secure that. So the wealth increasing next year more than this year, and that's where it links to. So what am I doing as part of that? Say, for example, next week, Tuesday, the Urban Research Center and the Minamata City will be signing an agreement. So at the local government level, not only the environmental departments, but the city as a whole will engage in agreement to have these utilized in an effective way. And we talked about the Japanese SDGs as an example, but the local government, what are they going to prioritize, what they're going to work on? So this type of the comprehensive evaluation will be done beyond the boundaries of local government. So we will try to identify local governments who will be involved, interested in involving, and want to collaborate with that. The same can be done for the businesses as well when they're thinking about infrastructure. So the priority on infrastructure can be evaluated from that kind of perspective. That's all. Thank you.
I have to say two things. I don't know whether this is economic strategy or not. I would say that SDGs question the quality of economic growth rather than the quantity of economic growth. So this is a shift from quantity to quality, as someone has already said. Basically, I fully agree with that. We are not talking about, we are talking about basic needs and sustainability. And these SDGs question the quality of economic growth or economic development. The change in quality means that there is a need for changing products and services, and that will translate into new business opportunities. Secondly, on the issue of community, in comparison to the MDGs, NGOs and non-state actors have been a part of the process in putting together SDGs. In comparison to the process of formulating MDGs, the process of formulating SDGs was an inclusive process. That is very important. In implementing SDGs, therefore, rather than implementing top-down, we need to respect initiatives of different actors, and we need to respect bottom-up initiatives implementing SDGs. And that, I believe, is a shared understanding. So community-based initiatives, they should be combined with local government's initiatives. And I believe, I hope that this will actually be the case. combining top-down and bottom-up in putting together community-specific objectives, targets, and hope that these targets and objectives will be implemented. Mr. Kuroda?
So I'll be very short. I talked about eco-farmer before. You may be surprised, you weren't clear as to why I did that. But if we look at the various regions in Japan, particularly agriculture is becoming a major issue, and the regional the sustainability is also something that it links to. But one of the questions talked about social security with everyone's participation. But in order to resolve the issues in the various local areas of Japan, then the various stakeholders involved, the process is quite difficult, but everyone will have responsibility for resolving those challenges. We have some examples of that. Say, for example, in Okinawa or in Shimane Prefecture, you may be aware of this, but the local government too understand that this methodology comes with a more difficult process, but in the end, it is most effective. So we do have some actual examples indicating that. And I think you can take some learning from that. In the area of agriculture, it's not only eco-farming, but the national the agricultural policies or TPPs, we need to also address agriculture in consistency with that. So that's also something that consumers need to think together about. And so all participation, not I think everyone needs to have the mindset of trying to work on resolving these.
Thank you very much. What about you, Mr. Professor Nishioka? Among the questions raised from the floor, there was an issue of GDP. Already, Mr. Mori talked about that. So as we study the local open society, we do not look at it from the perspective of GDP. We look at the vision that we need to put in place going forward. So for the future directions of Japan, RNDD would be the future society, but on the other hand, there is an idea that since technology is important in Japan, it's going to be the world, Japan is going to be the world's factory. And in addition to that, it's going to be the world of brands. Maybe we need, in the case of Italy, for example, just like the Nordic countries, maybe we can share things. How can we realize the 2 degrees society? We run different situations, and as a result comes the GDP. So from that perspective, SDGs themselves are the kind of vision that we need to achieve at minimum. So there will be different approaches. So if we are to, I don't think that it's necessary to bring in something so unnecessary like GDP. In the shared societies like Northern European countries, there will be less CO2, but there will be less GDP as well.
Just very quick reactions to 3 points. First of all, the point about economic growth and GDP growth. I think one of the important things about the SDGs is that it raises the issue of the economic model. The economic model that is being pursued in most countries of the world and internationally is producing a pattern of development that is not doing enough to create the right kind of employment, that is leading to unsustainable emissions. And that is why it is so important that we now have this goal, which is Goal 8, promote sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. And I think this is a big departure from the MDGs that almost, I think, deliberately, my interpretation that was that they deliberately skirted around these contentious issues of the economic model. And that is also related to the question about the PPPs, the private-public partnerships, you know, and this is one of these question marks and open questions about the future. And kind of a concern, you know, it's worrying that there is so much emphasis on the role of the business sector, as if the responsibility of government and the state to actually make sure that we have sustainable development that meets the people's needs would be abandoned and left to the private sector. So I think we're all worried about that, aren't we? We don't know what's going to happen under this process of PPPs. And thirdly, on the point about, well, we shouldn't be so negative about the MDGs. Yes, I agree with you. Of course, but this was a North-South agenda. So of course, for JICA, it was very useful to highlight the importance of reducing poverty. And indeed, you know, ODA did go up during the time, and ODA, particularly for the social sectors, went up. But the dark side of it is that there were things that were neglected. So agriculture, food, you know, was sort of flat, and economic infrastructure was also flat. Things that we now realize are very important. So it's a mixed picture.
ありがとうございます。できればもう一
Thank you. I had wished to go another round, but I'm afraid that we have run out of time. So I'm hoping that some of the remaining issues will be taken up by the following panel. But as some of you have mentioned, one of the key accomplishments of SDGs is there is a clear this is a clear statement that we are to change the society. And a sense of crisis is perhaps lacking in Japan in comparison to other countries around the world. So we need to have a sense of crisis, and we need to bring about a societal transformation. And this is something that we need to communicate in the Japanese society. And for us in Japan, this is going to be a key challenge going forward. There was this discussion about growth. How to grow economically is going to be a question for those who are focused on economy. The social elements, environmental issues will have to be taken into consideration in achieving economic growth. Those focusing on environmental issues will have to take into consideration equity and economic aspects of growth. For those focusing on social aspects, will have no luxury of neglecting social and economic factors. So these three will have to be taken into consideration in a comprehensive fashion, and that, I believe, is a consistent message that we have been hearing repeatedly. And since the early part of this symposium, in the second panel, we plan to discuss some of the issues that we have discussed in a more detailed fashion. With that, for the time being, we would like to bring this panel to a close, and we will give the microphone back to the moderator. Thank you once again. I would like to thank all the panelists, Professor Kanie and other panelists. Thank you very much. Please be back to your seats.